I've been an artist longer than I can remember. My mom says I was 2 when I started. My name's Theroux, and I'll be speaking here at Creative Mornings talking about how I use love for art. So it was almost 4 years ago today, almost exactly, that we opened the Gorilla House. I took my life savings and I rented a building for 3 months, and the idea was every Wednesday at 7 o'clock we would spin a wheel. This was a Lazy Susan I took out of my kitchen, and we would place books around the wheel and come up with 3 random ideas and paint for 2 hours. We'd spend the evening painting together. At 9 o'clock our host would come in and we would auction off the pieces, and everything would sell. Everybody was welcome and it was free to attend. And people would come in and try all kinds of things. One guy came in and he had balloon animals. This gentleman here recorded and wrote a song that evening based on the themes, and he sold off an MP3 and the rights to the lyrics and the melody. And these pictures, when I look at these pictures, they generally make me want to cry. We were so filled with happiness and joy every night. There was all kinds of people that would come in. Sometimes we had homeless people, and sometimes we had politicians, and we had just the entire gambit. Lots of smiling, laughing faces. This is my son. It was his idea to open the gallery. He was going to open up an art stand, and he'd put together, I think, 20 or 30 paintings, and they were all priced out between about $1 and $3, depending on how much you liked them. And I said, well, what if instead of this art stand, we open up an art gallery this summer? Part of the recipe for success was that we were very consistent. We went every single Wednesday, whether it was a holiday or not. And even if Wednesday landed on a Christmas, we would end up having a Christmas meal, kind of an orphan's meal. And, there was always people showing up. And we made sure that if it was a Wednesday, the doors were open between 7 and about 11 o'clock at night. There was a point where we had a line in the back of the space, and we always kind of joked around, if we ever clean past this line, we're going to lose the building. And we kind of had a month-to-month situation where eventually we brought the property value of what we did up to the point where they sold the building and booted us out. And that was pretty bone-crushing. But it only took us a couple days to sort of bounce back and decide to become more of an urban gentrification project, where instead of coming in and cleaning up the space we could afford and getting booted out, our new business model was to come in, clean up a space, and then walk away and leave that space in the hands of somebody else. So this is a picture of my son actually doing some planning for the new building. Cam showed up on the last day and started talking to us about taking over a new space. And we found another space that was equally drab and beaten up and dirty. And we spent about the 6 months in half the year that we were out of business trying to come up with a way to turn that space into something usable, which didn't work out. And when it didn't work out, we bought this van and drove to Venice Beach.
It looks a lot different.
And this is where we lived on Venice Beach for 2 weeks. We were there for exactly 14 days. We did 40 paintings, and we traded 40 paintings for 40 good deeds with people that came by. So a dentist gave a free dental extraction to somebody that didn't have insurance. That happened back in Atlanta. A movie producer that had never mowed a lawn before mowed his neighbor's lawn for the summer. A one-eared man named Sharkos went back to prison and read books to prisoners. And so and then we came back to Canada. We were planning to come back and tell Cam, that we didn't want to do it anymore. And he found us another spot that was a half block away from our apartment. And so we started the Rumble House. This is Alexander Elliot. He was the editor of Time magazine in the 60s. He was friends with Picasso. No, he was friends with Salvador Dali. He sat with Matisse on his deathbed, and he'd interviewed Picasso when he was young. And when we met this man, he just swept us away. And it was instantly, we had 2 breakfasts with him, and he instantly became our leader and our mentor. And there was this long walk to get to where we were on the beach, so we would go and meet him halfway. And I made him a painting, which just threw into his yard instead of giving to him. So we met him for breakfast the next day. Now, can you imagine I'd given a painting to one of the greatest art critics of our century. And I realized as soon as I gave it to him, it was completely inappropriate. And if he looked at me funny afterwards, I'd be crushed. So we're supposed to meet him for breakfast the next morning, and I skipped breakfast because I was terrified of being let down. And then it started eating at me, so I went down to breakfast, and we ate breakfast, and it was fantastic. And then, he hadn't said anything about the painting, so finally I kind of looked over and I heard my mouth say against my will, "Did you like my painting?" And he's like, "What painting?" Because he hadn't found the painting in the yard, so it worked out that I would never have to be disappointed. And so we walked back to our space, and so if you can imagine, it was about a 150-meter walk to the breakfast place. No, 500 meters to the breakfast place, 500 meters home. He finds the painting, and about 10 o'clock in the morning, one of our friends on the beach goes, "Hey, look over there." And I look, and at about this pace, he's coming down with this book in his hands. He wrote it in the 50s. Jess and I have bought 100 copies of this since. And he came and he just gave us a hug and talked and we chatted. And I found myself blurting again, "Did you like my painting?" And there was a long pause, and he's like, "Of course. It almost killed me to get here." We were leaving that day. We got in the van and we drove back to Calgary from LA. It's actually exactly 2,500 kilometers down the street from where I live. If you turn left on McLeod Trail, McLeod Trail turns into Highway 2, which turns into I-15, and it terminates on the spot where we were on the beach, where we met with Alex. And we spent almost a year reading this because it was so passionate and so important that we could only read 1 or 2 chapters at a time. We'd read it out loud in a special place. And then we went back and we met him the following year, a year later, and passed away the day after we left. So we keep buying this book. I brought it not to pitch it, but because it's more filled with love than anything I own. And it says in the front, "For Jessica and Rich with love from Alex." When I got back, we just started opening the Rumble House. And we lived with this guy on Venice Beach. So we just started opening the Rumble House. And like I said, we kind of decided to abandon the project. But Cam talked us into it. And within just a few weeks, we took this kind of bit of a rubble place. It doesn't even look like it should be downtown. We turned it back into our space, and we picked up where we left off, almost without effort. It just picked up and rolled again. Currently working on a book that tells the story of Girl House and Rumble House, but I've just given you all the best parts. So it's called "Stop Making Art and Die," and it's a threat. It's not asking you to stop making art. It's saying if you stop making art. But it's an adult coloring book. That's it's also an instructional manual, but it's also about how to live passionately with your addiction to making art. This is a page from the book that describes this piece, and I'd like to give this piece away for a good deed if somebody's interested later today. This is a more polished version of what I'll be talking about. If I have time, I want to tell you about this too. We'll see how gripped you are, and then that's just one of my paintings. Let me go back here, and I'll tell you about this structure. I was in my classroom. How much time do I have? 10 minutes. I was in my classroom, and I'd been given some time to do some planning, unit planning, and I stopped and I thought to myself, the magic question that every kid always asks me, why do I have to do this? And I was supposed to be working on like unit 10 of 50, and I stopped and I realized I don't really know why we have to do this. And I sat at my desk for about 4 hours, and my goal was to come up with 5 reasons why we make art. And I knew a couple of them off the top of my head. I haven't come up with 6, and I'm open to adding a 6th to this. And I have, it's definitely more than 4, but I knew in my heart that there was probably 5 reasons why we make art. The first one is the most obvious one. It's a search for quality. And so that's almost 97% about what we talk about in an art classroom. How to make a good line, how to create quality a line, how to balance color. Your androgynous color, Analogous color schemes. And so this is most of what we teach in school, how to make quality art. But beyond that, and we have this search for quality, right? It doesn't matter where you are, what you're doing. You get in a really nice car and you think to yourself, whoa, this is different. And then you get in an okay car and you think, it's okay. So we can't stop looking for the search for quality. But we also have this compulsion to communicate. And this was in my other talk. And I talked a little bit about how there's so many things that I really want to say that I can't say with words. And when I try and say them with words, they sort of fall apart. But I can say them with a poem. I can say them with a painting. I can say them with a dance, not in public, but I can say them with a dance. And so we reach into art when we're trying to express a really deep and personal feeling. And it's easy to understand when you get it across. It can be effortless, it can be painless, it can be a nod while you're hiking. You can look over and see a tree and nod at your friend and you feel like you've completely communicated. But sometimes you're trying to use your words and they just won't get the passion of it across. So we have a search for quality, we have a compulsion to communicate, but we also have a search for meaning. So when I'm going into physics, when I'm thinking about religion, when I'm thinking about this beginning of life, when I'm thinking about any grand idea that's hard to pull together, we start making pictures out of them, we start telling stories about, we start personifying birds into balls of clay and big bangs, and we start making these things out of pictures because it's, once you get to a certain level, you can only use really big pictures for really big ideas. There's a search for permanence, and I think sometimes parents get this one wrong. We have this idea that we want it to be in the NHL, and so you have a kid and you put your kid into hockey school and you drive them to hockey school, and around 15 they get old enough to decide they don't want to be in hockey school anymore. We make art to establish permanence because we want to live forever. And I remember a friend of mine saying that it was an Inukshuk that represented the search for permanence, and he was of the belief that that was the only reason for making art. And I said, well, there's some more, but in the search for permanence, if you flood your backyard and you throw the skates on at night and you go out and skate right after dinner, your kids will follow you out there. And you establish your permanence by living authentically and pushing your way through these things that you're passionate about. If you try and force your permanence on somebody else, it always falls apart. But we search for quality. I want to make good art. Compulsion to communicate. I have something I want to say. Searching for meaning. It's way too grand to write an essay about. I have a search for permanence. I want to last forever. And then this is the easiest one. It's the most common one. It's the one we can't avoid. That's the one you don't have to teach, is a compulsion to modify. You buy an iPhone, you pick out an iPhone case. You buy some shoes, you match your purse. You put on a pair of glasses, you spend half an hour picking the glasses that represent you. There's this object I've seen dangling on the back of a truck, and I think that doesn't need to be there, but we buy these things because we have a compulsion to modify. And so when you're not making use of art making, you have kids scraping their names into the desks. They have a compulsion to modify. And when we're not using these things properly, this one can be the most destructive. This one can be the easiest one to stumble upon. This one can probably be one of the most important things for your life. This one, the search for meaning, will haunt you forever. And if you do them all really well, you'll have a sense of permanence. How much time do I have?
You have 5 minutes.
5 minutes. Can I tell you my other big idea? Yeah? Okay. If this goes crashing off, we have to edit the video. Okay. So, I was going to give a talk, and I realized for my first talk I had to talk about why you might be excited about art, because a lot of people aren't. I know a lot of people loved art. I know a lot of people quit making art around the same age, which is where I work, junior high. But I was thinking about a lifelong plan, a tool that I could use to create kind of a safety net for myself, to keep myself in the game. And so I was trying to think about what it takes to maintain a lifelong passion for art making. This is in a triangle form, and it is progressive, but they're interchangeable, and I'll warn you in the middle, these three things are separate from the top and the bottom. So at the very base level of making art, you have to be authentic. If you live in a city where cowboy paintings really sell well, and you don't like cowboy paintings, you're going to be forcing yourself into a zone that you're not comfortable with. So at the very base level, you have to authentically love what you're doing. And it says that in this book, and it says that all the way through the Rumble House. It says that in the Gorilla House. You have to fall in love with the thing that you're doing. If you're doing a commission piece, you have to find a way to fall in love with that commission piece. If you're teaching a class, it's not good enough to say, we're learning this because it's in the textbook or part of the curriculum. You have to find a way to love every single thing that you're teaching. You just become a person that delivers property. But your work has to be authentic. Now, if you're making work that's ugly and authentic, you can be an outsider artist, but you're at least doing your own thing. If you try and make yourself into something you're not, it'll never have that quality that makes a piece of artwork different than a piece of craft. And a lot of people talk about what the difference between craft and artwork is. If you can take a piece of yourself and work it into an object, I would call a cup or a saucer or a bowl a piece of artwork. And if it's something that you're making without putting a piece of your soul into, maybe one way to describe it would be to call it craft. Now I know craft people are very particular about this, so be careful with that. After your work is authentic, and you have to be authentic before you go anywhere, you have to have an advocate. You have to have somebody standing beside you and saying, this is pretty good. If you stand up with your piece and say, this is the best piece in the world, you can sell it for $40. If you stand up with the same piece, somebody that doesn't know anything about you, and they say, this is the best piece in the world, you can sell it for $400. If you stand up in one of the minor galleries that does framing on the side, they can sell your same painting for $4,000, and there's one or two paintings in every country that can sell the same painting for $40,000. But it's the person standing next to you that's willing to put themselves out on your behalf that adds the value to that. The word for that is provenance. You can buy a guitar pick for under $1, but you can't buy Elvis's guitar pick for under $1. And the fact that Elvis has owned that piece is the provenance that makes that piece valuable. And some of the most valuable paintings in the world, that value is established because of the advocate who stands behind the painting and says, this is valuable. Do I have time? Okay, after advocate, your work has to be palatable on some level. On some level, somebody has to look at your work and say, I love this. If they don't, that's cool. You can stay authentic. I think I said this, but then you're an outsider. An outsider artist making work for yourself for the passion of it. If your work is palatable, if there's somebody else in the world that likes it, it's going to move and you can keep making it. If they don't, you can keep making it, but it's not going to move. Then unfortunately, you have to be timely. So Van Gogh, for instance, was not timely. He was absolutely authentic. His brother, Theo, was his advocate. His work was not palatable for the time, but then you have to stay feral, which is like a tame animal, which we're all raised as. You become wild when you run out into the woods and become an artist. And you have to stay wild. And Van Gogh stayed wild enough that even after his death, his authenticity, his advocate, his work became palatable, his work became timely, and it defined a generation of artists. It defined a whole movement of artists. And so, you can see examples where this doesn't hold together. You might have a musician that's not very authentic. And that musician might have an advocate, perhaps like a big corporation. If you have a big enough corporation, you can have an artist that's not authentic, excelling. They will generally be palatable, likable. They will be timely, and their time will not last. And they rarely stay feral. These are the two things you have control over. You can start out authentic and you can stay feral. The Beatles, I hope I can say that without copyright infringement. They were absolutely authentic. Their advocate was George Martin. Their work was incredibly palatable, incredibly timely, and I think Paul McCartney stayed very feral. The Stones, Keith Richards stayed way more feral, right? But you can apply this, and it's just a thought experiment, to almost anything in your life. After we picked up some momentum, there were a couple really unbelievable job opportunities that came up. And I used this chart to save my life a couple times. I looked at, was the work authentic? it was authentic enough. Was the person offering me a job a great enough advocate, and almost always considered the job? Would it be palatable? Sure, it would be palatable. Was it timely? Definitely timely, but if it wasn't something where I could stay feral, if it wasn't something that allowed me to stay wild, then I would end up turning it down. And one of the things that keeps us at Gorilla House and Rumble House is a little bit wild is that we also subsidize our work with other things like teaching and other things. So basically, the last two things, I don't know if you can see these. These are two guys that I think maybe wanted to pick a fight with me at the end of the street. And that's a painting of my son. And when I was walking down the street, these two gentlemen pulled me over to have a conversation. They weren't crazy about the way the gentleman I was walking with was looking at them. So I was talking and talking and talking and trying to figure out what the issue was. And at one point I said, I don't have any money. And one of the gentlemen opened up his wallet and he had $500 in his wallet. He's like, I don't want your money. I'm like, well, how can I help you? And he said, I just want a place in this world. And he went on to explain that the guy that I was walking with, we're looking at them. They were hanging it out on the street corner, and he felt like, we're just sitting here. And I'm going to fight you because you invaded my space of just sitting here. But the expression on his face when he said, I just want a place in this world, I realized he wasn't picking a fight with me. He was asking for peace. And I think I fell a little bit in love with both these guys. I asked to take his picture, and I took his picture. And I think I made that painting in about 45 minutes. It wasn't very long. And I know this painting here, this painting of my son, under 2 hours. And I know some of my friends will rattle me sometimes about the formal qualities of my work. But what I can tell you is that all of it's filled with love. And right now, that's what I got going for me. So that's my talk. Thank you very much.
How long have you been working on this system or this?
This came to me almost a year ago, and it's held me out of trouble at least 4 times. The other one on the back was something I came up with at the beginning of this year teaching. It completely changed how I interact with people, completely it changed how I interact with my work. I mean, there's no data, right? Like I can't give you a pie chart that says it's 67% urge to communicate. But those were the things that made sense to me. And even if you modified it and changed it to your own beliefs, like, I don't know about this search for quality, if you check one out and add something else. The trick is, like you said when you're reading the manifesto, or when we wrote our manifesto, that establishing your belief system in advance is one of those things that you can go back, you need something tactile you can go back to and point at and say, am I still doing my job right? People are really passionate about vision boards. And one of the things you real about artists is we visualize everything. So you'll have a coach of every single team in a professional sport with a professional visualization coach, and the basketball players lay on their backs and they imagine balls going through the hoops, and they get better at putting balls through the hoops, right? But artists, we're visualizing all the time. So if you're walking down the street visualizing falling down and hit your head, the chances of you falling down and hitting your head increase because we're good at visualizing, right? Like it's just part of what we do. So I think maybe like you kind of see this system where a lot of artists end up sort of isolated and feeling, bad for themselves. And the more they start down that path, the more powerful they are about controlling that destiny. So it's important to have a talisman or some sort of object that you can use to keep yourself on track. Yeah.
As to the one on the other side there, have you thought of sort of using that to explain other people's careers and jobs? And it's not just art.
Yeah, it works great for music. It works great for just throw something at me. Let's do it. What do you do?
I'm a photographer.
Oh, well, photography is easy, right? So, because it's one of the arts, but let's just talk. Like, your human need to communicate through a photo, right? And that's the difference sometimes between like a million cell phones in your pocket and you wanting to tell a story with a picture, and it's always worth at least 1,000 words. in search of meaning, right? I have a time-lapse camera that I put on in search of meaning, but then as a photographer, I go through and I find that image that tells the story. A really good photographer can walk in and go, click. I'll let the camera run for his 72,000 iterations. A compulsion to modify. Well, and then that's something you probably battle with more than me, because you get the photo in and you're like, I should just Photoshop this a little bit, and touching up. I don't know how you feel about that, but I know that there's this sort of movement against like not using filters. I love filters because I'm a painter, but yeah, the compulsion to modify you cannot fight. In search of quality, of course, and to establish permanence. Actually, photos are great for permanence because they get out there and they start spreading around, right? So there might be millions of photos out there. But do you have another?
But like engineering, this could be perfect for engineers too.
Yeah. And it makes sense, right? Because I always talk to kids about like how old things are. The oldest pigment would be 100,000 years old. We used burnt wood on the wall. And then 40,000 years later, we started using yellow and red. And then 8,000 years ago, 60,000 years. So 40,000 years ago, we started using yellow ochre, red ochre. 8,000 years ago, we started using Egyptian blue. And you see from different philosophies, the people that follow the literature saying, it's strange because the colors arose as words in that order. And the pigments, the artists were using came in that order as well. So you do see these crossovers. But at the same time, I like to try and talk about whether art came before language and whether math became before art. Well, it seems like you would have started building words out of pictures. And so when we start to understand art, because how can you understand art with language if art's older than language, right? So once you find a way to start talking about the art, you can apply it to just about anything we would use language for. Anybody think of a career that wouldn't work with this? Because that'd be fun if we had. Yeah?
My dad sells janitorial supplies.
Okay. So, it's not so simple as showing up on somebody's front door with a wet mop, right? Like you have this urge to communicate the importance of these supplies. And what is the meaning of this mop? Well, the meaning of the mop would definitely be removing the bacteria that will kill you. This is actually quite powerful already. Compulsion to modify wouldn't just be cleaning up the area. That would be purely practical. But the compulsion to modify is, this mop's maybe a little too long for me. And, your dad has sold a mop to somebody who was so into this mop, they sawed 6 inches off the mop to get a better grip on it, or possibly hockey taped the stick, right? Search of quality, right? And I actually tell this metaphor all the time. I had this big 12-foot mop in a coffee shop when I was a young man, and it was pretty ratty, and the owner bought and sold the place, and the owner came in. The first thing he did was he threw out the mop, and he replaced it with a plastic mop that was exactly 8 feet long. And I came up with this definition that day that, this is a fine example of the guy who bought the mop is not the guy who uses the mop. And I went into the dumpster and I grabbed this 12-foot handled mop and I could really swab the floors, but definitely in search of quality, your dad sells good mops, I'm sure.
Yes. I will be his advocate.
And look we're standing here talking about it right now. Right? So, yeah. I mean, actually, it's pretty exciting to see that you guys get this because I've talked to people about this before, and sometimes it just goes, whoosh, but yeah, it can be used for anything. Any other questions? That was pretty fun. Thank you.